Welcome, everyone. My name is David Garza, as you heard. I am the Development Director for Engagement and Advancement here at Point Foundation. I want to start by thanking all of you for joining us for tonight's Fall Scholar Showcase. We're especially excited about tonight's discussion as October is LGBTQ History Month. And we have some brilliant minds here this evening to discuss various aspects of our rich and complex history. The goal of tonight's showcase is to keep our family of supporters connected to the work we do. As you know, the pandemic has kept us physically apart for a year and a half now, but we want to make sure that you're up to date on the incredible accomplishments and the ongoing work of our scholars. And before I go any further, let me thank our generous sponsors for the Scholar Showcase. You can see them right next to me, Dr. John Downey and Mr. Brad Heiss, TiVo, Victoria's Secret and Company, and Wells Fargo. Now, shortly you'll be hearing from current Point Scholars Kirin Gupta, Tyler McDougald, and Xoë Sazzle, who will be in discussion and answering questions that were submitted in advance by registrants. But first, please allow me to introduce our moderator, Dr. George Omwat. Dr. Omwat is an assistant professor of global health at Stony Brook University. He earned his PhD from Columbia University in 2018 and completed postdoctoral training in legal history at Princeton University in 2020. Dr. Omwat's research focuses on the effect of anti-inflationary economic policy and colorblind legal ideology on public hospitals. He directs the inaugural Global Health and Health Inequality Mapping Lab in Africana Studies at Stony Brook. Dr. Omwat is currently completing a book manuscript tentatively titled Medical Scarcity: The Political Economy of Healthcare Rights in America. And here at Point, we are especially proud of him as he is an alum from our scholar class of 2009. Welcome, Dr. Omwat.
Thank you so much, David Garza, for that very kind introduction, extensive introduction. It's been an honor to be a Point scholar and alum, and I'm so happy to be in a group with a bunch of our wonderful scholars. So as I introduce them, I hope that when I finish introducing their bios that they may unmute themselves and just say hi so people can connect a story to a face and a name and a voice. And so we'll start off with Kieran Gupta. And Kieran Gupta is the Point Walter Decker flagship scholar. She is studying international law and legal history at Harvard Law School. And Kieran grew up around the nation's capital, though she spent her teenage years in India working in an institute for folks with disabilities, then spending a further year working in the Amazon in a government clinic serving indigenous communities. Kieran returned to the US for college and went on to graduate at the top of her class from Harvard College. And working with other students in the International Women's Rights Collective and Sexual Health Education Advocacy throughout Harvard group, she became deeply invested in questions and campaigns around reproductive justice and evolved her understanding and work as she took on the directorship of both organizations. She's co-founded an organization with other Asian American femme-identifying folks that specifically attended to intra-Asian diversity with a focus on queer identity as a constitutive part of the community. Kieran's work with the Race Relations Office and Women's Center continued after she returned to Harvard as a JD PhD student in history and women's and gender and sexuality studies and law, studying women terrorists in the former British Empire. So everyone, please welcome Kieran.
Hi, everyone. So great to be with y'all tonight.
Next, we have Tyler McDougald. Tyler McDougald is the recipient of Point Foundation's Arnold T. Schwab Endowed Scholarship. He is studying English and history at Clemson University. Tyler was born and raised in Greenville, South Carolina. It was not until he began studying English and history at Clemson University that he found a supportive, queer community to belong to. Seeking to create a more inclusive and supportive university, he founded and currently serves as president of Clemson Rainbow Fellowship, South Carolina's only LGBTQ collegiate mentorship program. In addition to Clemson Rainbow Fellowship, he has sought and served in multiple leadership positions within Clemson undergraduate student government and serves as the Senate Inclusion and Equity Chair during the 2020-2021 school year. After graduation, Tyler hopes to attend law school with a focus on public service and plans to use his education and privileges to better the station of LGBTQ plus individuals who find themselves with a particular interest in the decriminalization of HIV. Welcome Tyler, rather. Read that cue.
No worries. So honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Last but not least, we have Xoë Sazzle. Xoë Sazzle is a Point BIPOC scholar studying women's and gender studies at Columbia University. Xoë is an artist, activist, communicator, digital dreamer, contemporary collaborator, and a Caribbean queen. Her activism for the past 7 years in Trinidad has included performing as drag queen Ms. Janae and creating safe places and safe spaces for queer people. She currently serves as co-chair of Pride TT, an organization that galvanized the first public Pride parade in 2018. She also serves as the community liaison officer for the Trinidad and Tobago Transgender Coalition. Xoë plans on leveraging her Ivy League education while bolstering her community resources to further the work that has begun. Legislation is needed for gender markers, thereby enabling our trans population to integrate smoothly into society and gain more equitable access to employment, healthcare, and social services. Welcome, Xoë.
Thank you for having me. So honored to be here. So excited for this conversation.
I'm excited too, and indeed a conversation it will be. We're so happy to mark October, which is LGBTQ History Month, with a discussion about all of these scholars' fantastic work and advocacy and organizing. And I just kind of want to start off kind of very informally to ask you guys, where are you calling from? And how has the pandemic affected you and sort of met you up to this moment?
I guess I could start since I believe I am the one not in the Northeast right now. I am currently calling in from Clemson, South Carolina. If you don't know that, it's the one right under North Carolina. And the pandemic has been interesting. I think the biggest kind of reaction I've had to it is I fill my cup with a lot of the work that I do, especially on campus. And you don't get that re-energizing virtually. And I found myself having to adopt a new project this year, and it being just taking care of myself, kind of the mantra, put the oxygen mask on yourself before you try to help anybody else. And that has been an incredible lesson for me to learn, and one that my Point mentor, Deepal Shah, has been invaluable in learning. So it's kind of been my experience the past couple of months.
For me, it's been interesting. Right now, I'm in New York. I just begun, so I'm an undergraduate at Columbia. And so this is my first year. And so I just moved to New York City from Trinidad in August. So I was in Trinidad for the majority of the pandemic. And even right before I came, Trinidad was under very strict lockdown. So coming to New York was at first a culture shock in that sense of just people. I hadn't seen such groups of people existing in public spaces in a long time. But the transition has been beautiful. I'm so happy to be not only out of the lockdown of Trinidad, but also to just, be at Columbia. And they've done a great job at just beginning to integrate, into coming back on campus. And there's very much that sense, I'm sure Kieran and Tyler, you might explain also from your perspectives, there's that sense of first now coming back onto campus and not having been on campus for such a while. And so I think there's that added excitement in the air.
Great.
I love that. So for me, I'm in Cambridge. I've been in Boston for the past almost 10 years now, and I am attached to it, but also I'm almost ready for a change. Almost. I think when graduation comes, I'll be ready for that change. And it was really something I think to experience exactly that thing of how do you fill your cup when you're on your own, especially if being in community is something that is so essential to you. And I discovered a whole very introverted side of myself, and I'm hoping to carry that forward without letting it hold me back. I think as a lot of us, definitely myself, have a little bit more anxiety about moving through the world at this point than maybe we did a couple of years ago in certain ways. And in certain ways, we know ourselves far better.
Yeah, that's like such an excellent point, Kieran. I mean, kudos on introversion. I've definitely dug deep into that well. Just thinking about all the ways in which the prior world had us in a hustle and a bustle, and this newer world, obviously, it comes with its challenges, but we're able to do things like this, which is meet virtually with ease and with other people in our Point family, which I think is really, really cool. And just thinking about this month, though, LGBTQ History Month, one of the introverted things for me as a historian has been just reading books and reading into history and looking at prior models, especially in this prior year of, you know, uprising around racial justice issues, the pandemic itself. This has been a really rousing time. So I wonder for you guys, is there a sort of role model or person in LGBTQ plus history that you kind of think of or have encountered during your time of kind of engaging with the history?
I can start us off on this one. So one person I think about a lot, and someone who really inspired me, even in starting my my research, is Ronnie Lakshmibai, the Rani of Jhansi. And I study, as George mentioned, I study the women terrorists of the former British Empire. And so these are folks who were scattered all over, and a lot of the rebellion in which they partook was anti-colonial rebellion. And these are some of the first acts that really got this legal name of terrorism, and a lot of the counterterrorist structure, the legal structure that we use now in the name of counterterrorism, and which we often abuse now in the name of counterterrorism, emerged from that same legal structure in the British Empire. So Rani Lakshmibai is such an important figure to me because she is one of the first people who really refused to, I think, kowtow in any way. And there's something about the way that she fought back that was incredibly femme, and that's really important to me as a part of my queer identity. But she also was a queer woman, and she led an army of women. And it was something that at the time it was unheard of. She was considered kind of animalistic, and and all of the classic terms that you can imagine, I think, were leveled at her by these British soldiers that she was fighting. And she refused to cede this land of Jhansi. That's why Rani of Jhansi, she was the queen of Jhansi. And she built this regiment, and she trained all these women to be soldiers, which is itself, I think, a radically queer act. And in order to fight colonialism. And so for me, a huge part of why her life story is so important to me is because I think that doing the most radically queer work we can does mean doing it intersectionally. It does mean fighting back against all of these axes of oppression. And she is one of the ultimate examples, from the 1800s, but she's one of the ultimate examples of that to me. And she was one of those first freedom fighters against the British Empire. And that's the struggle that, honestly, in so many ways, mentally, economically, in our whole global supremacy, like we're still fighting today in South Asia.
Mm. That's such a fascinating story.
Yeah, for me, I went a little more along, we would say the typical route, but from a point of personal connection, Marsha P. Johnson is definitely one of the figures that has really impacted me in a very mirror-like way. You know, when we look at the point in time in history that was Stonewall, and the kind of convergence of energies that were happening at that time that bubbled over into this eruption and this demonstration, really, and kind of Marsha's decision to stand not only in the center, but stand also in the center of identities. You know, some people describe Marsha as a drag queen, some describe her as a transgender woman, but we understand that in those times, the language did not even take us to that point yet, but yet still she existed in the fullness of identity. And I think back to 2018 in Trinidad and Tobago, when we were on the point of contesting the buggery law that has been passed on to us from colonialism. And it was such very much the same point of tension in the society. And I found myself at the forefront of one of the demonstrations that led us to changing and overturning that law. And to stand in such a unique place, at times you have no idea before, during, what's actually happening. You don't really have a sense of the scale and a sense of the generations. We're talking about LGBTQ history. We don't have a sense of the generations of history that have brought us to a point in time when history can actually then be changed for the future. And so even recently I looked at the documentary again with Marsha and Sylvia, and it just brought back into focus how sometimes all it takes is just showing up to change the course of history, because we never know what today could mean 20 years from now.
Wow, this is just so heartening. And what a slingshot from what Kieran just described in the 18th century to the very present day. And this continuity of, the British Empire and empire law, buggery law being a sort of inheritance that we're still struggling with to this day. Wow, thank you for sharing that story. And we are going to get deeper into both of those connections. Tyler.
Yeah, I don't know how I could possibly follow that up. That's just absolutely blew my mind. When I thought about this question, I thought very close to home. There's a gentleman, Dr. Ken Schell, who is now a professor in the state of Georgia, and he is a Clemson alumni. And in the late 1980s, a little bit before his time at Clemson, the University of South Carolina tried to deny the university's first LGBTQ student organization from being recognized by the university. And there was a big district court case and yada, yada, eventually getting to, that they can't deny that on the basis of, students want to organize, they can organize. And just a couple of years later, in 1990, at that point, just Ken Schell organized these hangouts of students at a local little tavern in our college town. And he, as a Black man, there just kind of was trying to find a place to build community here. And that grew and grew, and it outgrew the little tavern. And eventually he decided to go the route that his predecessors at the University of South Carolina went, to start an LGBTQ organization at Clemson, the Lambda Society. And it was hugely contentious at Clemson. One of my pieces of research as an undergrad has been on LGBTQ student organizing. And it was really weird because South Carolina, 1990s, very conservative, very traditional. You're trying to start a student organization and most of your members aren't out because there are material dangers. There was a sting, a cruising sting a year before that 2 professors and a student got caught up in, and one of the professors committed suicide. This was a mortal matter. But regardless, he and this group, wildly, but not super intentionally, intersectional group, came together and, proposed becoming an organization that had to be approved by the undergraduate student senate at the time. And it was just this momentous fight, but he kept on. He was one of the public faces. It had drama in it. One of the senators ended up pronouncing that she was a part of the Lambda Society at that point. And it passed by 1 vote. And I feel really connected to Ken because of, his starting this organization, really beginning this wave of organized queer students at my university, and also being able to utilize the same body that nearly stopped him from just being able to organize the students in the same way that we have a chocolate milk club now, to bring the queer community in an organized fashion, and be able to work in that body for so long. And I got to talk to him a little bit before the pandemic, and he was just the nicest, just most sincere and just kind of like didn't think anything of it. And kind of to Zoe's point, like you really don't know in the moment when you're making history, and that like, you know, 30 years down the line, some little like kid's gonna call you up and be like, hey, can we talk about this student organization you started? And that's still alive and vibrant at Clemson. And so that's someone who I really think to and reflect on as I'm doing work here in South Carolina.
Wow, that is just so fantastic, Tyler. And it's clear you're doing some archival research, you're doing oral history, local history, sometimes the hardest history in the sense because you don't have a lot of other people telling you the story, so you have to figure it out yourself. So I'm really in awe of what you have to say. And to even put some context on it and to draw it into what Kieran and Zoë were talking about, you know, this is the context of Bowers v. Hardwick, right? This is the post-1986 ruling of the Supreme Court that essentially institutes a buggery law prohibition and uses it to police the bodies of gays and lesbians and transgender people in this country. And it's just fascinating that you're able to then take an event 4 years later and transform it into this fantastic institutional history that I hope people really thank you for doing, because it's important work. So this kind of leads me to the next question. I mean, it's almost implicit in everything that you guys have said about, you know, your motivations for learning about LGBTQ history, how you go about studying it. My question is, what is the sort of experience in your body seeing an example from the past and knowing you yourself have to make history?
I think Kieran kind of alluded to this. Just by like living and existing, like we are making history. Like I am probably an embodiment of far too many gay male stereotypes at my little Southern school. But because of that, I've had so many people, especially like after Senate meetings or after the year has concluded or whatever, like they come out and like radically change their life and attribute it to like you just like being your old like gay, loud, you know, dramatic self. And that's really exciting, just to be able, like, in persevering and living through yourself, you almost give permission to others to do the same. And that's just always a really exciting, gratifying feeling to hear that.
Yeah, I think, you know, tying it to what Tyler said, it's the showing up, right? It's you know, the living is in showing up, really. And I think the creation of history is cumulative in that 10 years ago, somebody showed up, which allowed us in a younger self to see that and realize that we could show up too in our fullest selves. And now as we live and commune and show up, there are younger people that look at us and will build on that and will bring things to the table and movements to the table that, you know, we can only imagine and we can't imagine actually, because it's yet to be created. So I think therein is the crux, you know, just the awareness that in showing up, we bring something to the table, our own contribution to history.
I love that. And I think there is really something about doing this work of excavating stories that have been really intentionally suppressed. I think queerness has been shut out of so many archives. It's been literally erased and burned and eviscerated from so many of the stories that we already know. And there is something really powerful and exciting and full of radical possibility to be one of those people who gets to write us back in any small way.
So,
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, please go ahead, Tyler. I'm just in awe right now.
I was like, one of the things when I was thinking of this topic is like learning from your history and to like inform how you proceed in the future, and just trying to gobble up as much like queer civil rights history. That's one thing that I'm especially interested in. The like intersection and borrowing between the Black civil rights movement and the queer civil rights movement in our country is just really, really fascinating, and how like especially like graduating from Mattachine and the Daughters of Bilitis to like the Gay Liberation Front and pulling a little bit more like radical in your face, like zapping tactics that were borrowed from Black civil rights movements is really informative now, especially when we like at the same time kind of have like the most accepting and progressive society in terms of queerness, although there's a lot of room to be done. There's this sort of comfortability that we have. And at the same time, that's paralleled by one of the largest racial social justice uprisings in decades. And it's just without noticing and understanding and knowing how we like came to this point and where, you know, I can get married and where Bostic is a potential, like a possibility for a Supreme Court decision. I think is really important for me as like a white cis gay in South Carolina to recognize like that I'm not disconnected from these other struggles. And that really helps inform my like perspective and point of view and the work that I do, like Kieran and Xoë have said, in the intersectionality of history and advocacy.
Yeah, and that's such an illuminating answer, Tyler. I mean, this kind of, to your point about the intersections between, for example, mainstream civil rights and the GLF, the Gay Liberation Front, you know, one thing that I found out through a colleague's research was that the GLF regularly went to congresses with the Black Panther Party, that they were invited and vociferous participants in these meetings. So that like really shocked me when I learned it, because at the time there was this, at the time in this meeting in college, like talking about, you know, experiencing the legalization of gay marriage and seeing it being pitted against Black civil rights history and being very confused why gay was being pitted against Black, for example. But in your work, is there a surprising fact that, you know, other people don't know about that you think they should know about? For example, I was just so shocked about that BPP GLF collaboration factoid. Is there anything similar in your work?
Me specifically, or for the whole group?
For the whole group, yeah. Zoom makes it very hard to kind of direct a question to everyone. But yeah, for everyone, I mean, each of you are doing this work. Is there some sort of surprising fact or something that people don't know about that they should know about?
One thing I always think of, and that actually is a source of hope in a way, I think, is we didn't have laws banning any kind of queer sexual activity in South Asia before colonialism. And we just have had this major decriminalization struggle over Section 377. And that was all about decriminalizing queer sex. And the fact that there just was no such thing. There were legal structures in South Asia, all over South Asia. It's not that there weren't laws, it's that there were no laws specifically banning queer sex acts. And this sense of Western superiority, I think, in a lot of ways, as we were watching this struggle for decriminalization, was something that I actually could not get out of my head until I learned some of this history. And that has so much to do with being like rooted in two places, being a part of the diaspora, and feeling like there was something that my home country, the country that my family is from, had to do to catch up to this country that they chose to come to. And I think in thinking that through, learning a lot of this history, I find that like doing some of that deconstructive work with history, you really can think hard about like where these sources of oppression are. It actually helps us undo them in a way that gives us these possibilities for a far more open future. And it also gives us that sense of self that we can come from places of freedom and not just places of oppression in doing this work.
Karen, I think it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because it was only when you said it I remembered. So what I'd mentioned in 2018, there was a gentleman named Jason Jones, and he took the government to court to challenge the buggery law. And actually, in India's decriminalization case, Jason Jones is from Trinidad and Tobago. That case from Trinidad was referenced as a major point, and it's because we've been inheritors of the very same colonial law. So I think even that point of international and cross-nation intersectionality is so interesting, and also we won't get into too much of a conversation about the tentacles of colonialism.
And we here in the States forget that Lawrence v. Texas was in 2003. Like,
exactly. Yeah,
I was 5 years old.
Yeah, from Bowers v. Hardwick, 1986, to Lawrence v. Texas, 2003. It's this interregnum. It's this like period in which the court really mobilized essentially imperial law from the British Empire, in a sense. We don't talk about it that way, but essentially mobilized it to police our sexuality and police our bedrooms and reduce our rights to privacy. So these are the work you're doing may sound small bore, but actually has deep bearing on the law, on the way in which we understand the past. Historians have been recruited into the courtroom, for example, to file amicus briefs and to add context to a lot of tricky questions that show up in the court that impede people like us who might be threatened by the law outside of the United States. So it's so interesting to have this conversation, because obviously there's been a progress of sorts here in the United States, but there's also this lingering construct of sort of anti-queer law in many other countries that is a legacy of the very people who, in a sense, sprouted the seed for the United States, right? So it's all connected, is what I'm saying, and what I'm hearing. But I want to kind of drill down a little bit. I pardon our audience, I like nerding out a little bit, but I want to find out a little bit more about the archival method for you guys. Like, Tyler, you're doing all this work to do oral history, to kind of dig up, I'm assuming, newspapers and other sort of memoranda. So you're doing this through your activism and through direct engagement with government. Kieran, you're doing it through your close reading of 18th century, 19th century sources, which is so powerful. What barriers have you guys encountered in trying to do this work? I mean, it's so nice to kind of sit in the Zoom room and get the stories, but this is hard work. So what hurdles did you guys have to cross to get access to, as Kieran said, some archives that are completely destroyed? Like, what methods are there to even read this history if you don't even have archives, for example?
Well, I keep going first, and I recognize I'm the white man in the room. But for me, it's just being at a Southern university. We don't have like a gender, sexuality, queer, like studies program. We have a minor that's way underfunded. Everything done here is either done at the behest of professors at their like own expense or by students out of interest. Like my project going through student newspapers and just like archives and archives of them. So it's just something that's really important to me is institutional support, like this idea, multifaceted idea of making a home in more ways than just four walls and a roof. If you don't have the institutional support to do that kind of work, then you're always going to have to sacrifice something from yourself in order to do it. Mm-hmm. And that's just not cool.
I might jump in also and just say, I think it is really important to fill out what we think of as traditional history with a lot of other methods. And this is something that we really get from History of the Global South is how do we do and how do we value oral history? And it's something that honestly queer activists have done for so many years because it was one of the only ways to preserve our history in this country and all over the world. And I think it's a source of power, and it really speaks to doing social history and history that's grounded in your community and history that's for your community. You don't want to be writing about the past for no one who's going to read it in the present or in the future. And I think a lot of that is also finding ways to narrate it that are accessible I think it's so cool and such a privilege to be in a space like this, to be talking to folks who are historians, who aren't historians, who may care about history, who may know some of this or not know some of it. I think it's too easy to just talk to the people who are thinking along the same exact track as we are. And I think that's a huge part of like also figuring out how to do history well, is how do we tell those stories beyond ourselves?
Yeah, I think as Kirin mentioned, you know, in oral histories, so coming from where I've come from, a lot of our history is passed on through just intergenerational communal connections, you know, our conversations with each other, which as we've come into more of a digital age, younger people communing with the older has become such a harder point of connection. Even at Pride TT, we had to instill a program called Generation Gap, which literally brought the older queer community into the room with the younger queer community. And there was such a interrogation, you know, bright-eyed of these young queer folks asking, wow, how did you do this in your time? You know, how did you understand this about yourself in a time when you didn't exist outside of your own communities, you weren't represented? And I think that's one of the things actually for me, which is so empowering about being able to attend a school, an institution such as Columbia University and study women's and gender studies, is being able to now not just depend on oral histories and my own interpretations of self and history from my own community, but stepping into now the global space and accessing education and archives and materials and challenges that allow you to dig much deeper into global perspective and get more of that. But I think it's still such a journey.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just loving this conversation because it just is a illustration of how when we trust ourselves and our expertise and our prior experience, and we bring ourselves into our own forums, we can really generate some, you know, bird's eye view perspective on all the work that our four ancestors have done for us to pave the way to this moment. And I'm also thinking a lot about how oral history has been so key in things like African history, griot cultures, oral transmission, not a heavy prioritization on printing things out on paper and archiving them. And even in modern American queer history, you know, some of the earliest historiographical moves in the history of sexuality was about rumor and the importance of things like phone trees and things like flyers and buttons. I remember when I was beginning some of my dissertation research, I went to the Lesbian Her Story Archive in Park Slope, and there's a special room where you pull, it's called the ephemera room, and you pull out a drawer, and there are all these really cool pins and t-shirts from activism at the time. And I was able to have intergenerational conversations with people who were managing the archive. And so, Xoë, you were kind of alluding to this by talking about sort of the work that you do through your group. But what do you guys think about the importance of sort of intergenerational conversations for preserving and transmitting LGBTQ history, for understanding it in the first place? Like, I mean, we are a new generation. Like, for us, like, should we not be, you know, a little humble as to how we can read even the past, right? What do you see as the sort of possibility for queer elders and queer young people to come to know one another and to be able to share these stories and make sure this history is preserved?
I'll just jump off. Just, you know, as I was mentioning, I think that there's not only so much possibility, but there's so much importance in there. We talk about oral history, but there are even sometimes the older generation bring things like photos, right? Polaroids. And not only that, but there's also so much history within cultural expressions. So sometimes there's music that has come out of a generation, and we think at times that this music might just be simply social commentary, but this music is a reflection of also queer history in that time. Even, you know, for us, we have calypso music, which we think of being so mainstream in Trinidadian culture, but there are times when queer people are referenced within that music. And even though at the time it may have been derogatory, when you look into the lyrics, you look into what was happening at the time, you see that this was a form of inclusion. And so I think now, and looking forward, I think what's most important is getting us into the same rooms, you know, and now as we see, we have the opportunity like here for that room to be virtual. But it's so important, and not just getting us into the same rooms, but recording it, you know, and documenting it, and getting our queer elders to tell us their histories, personal histories, communal histories, and for us to document that, be it through documentaries or simply through podcasts, you know, in a way that ensures that as we now are in such a digital age and have the opportunity to make sure that history isn't just burned or obliterated, we are now the keepers of that history. I think even now it's so much more important, and it's on us, and you know, spaces like these do exactly that.
Mm.
I think going right off of this, I think that's so beautifully said. And it's really important to, I think, keeping our community thriving, that we do it in a way that is respectful of the fluidity of how these stories are developing, and also where they're coming from. Our queer elders are living, breathing, amazing humans who are also developing and growing. And I think so much of what I would tell myself and my community, my peers, my elders, I would just ask for like that little bit of grace and respect that we need to give one another, to just trust that at the time that someone before us was doing something that was the right thing at that time, there are reasons for it, and it's worth knowing those reasons, and we want to understand why and how we got here. And we can be so grateful for all of the steps that folks have taken ahead of us. At the same time, I think we really have to take that time to try and understand why it was done in a certain way. And I think to try and embody that to whatever extent we can, to really like have a sense of that experience and not feel like we need to freeze this narrative in a linear way, or we need to put it into like a single frame. I think we need to do all of this work of preservation and keeping that I was talking about, but really do it with that sense of fluidity and that sense of grace for one another. And I hope that we can ask that of our elders as well, that they give that grace to young people, that they wait for us to catch up to where they're at in their thinking, but also that we have this trust that we can learn from one another, that it's not a one-way kind of learning.
I am so glad that you said that. Like, that hit me so hard. The historical nuance is so important. Zoe mentioned this earlier, like Marsha P. Johnson, like there literally wasn't the vocabulary that we have now for them to explain their identity. And we see like this, like almost like queer boomer syndrome or something like that, where like the progressive, like just expansive understanding and ever-growing understanding of identities that we have right now wasn't available to those 10 years ago, let alone 40 or 50. And there's this tension. Yeah, so I don't feel well equipped to go into that more right now. But one thing that I was really thinking about with your question, George, is like how like queer history can inform like what's going on right now, and like how we can like understand how we got here. Something that I always think about is like when you hear especially gay men complain about like hookup culture and the like sexual foundation of queerness, like that derives from when queerness was outlawed and would get you fired and like lose your livelihood and everything. The only way that you had to express or engage in queerness was through physicality, and that's something that's been embedded in like a subsection of our community's DNA. Or how, you know, like now younger queer people think, oh, like the lost generation to AIDS. I've seen discourse over this over social media. And part of that is true. Like, it's good to recognize that there was like a great travesty, but it's also the sensationalizing of the virus, because we didn't lose an entire generation. There are plenty of people here that have lived through the epidemic either without getting the virus or undetectable, or living, you know, their best life in however many ways. And because of the like cis heteronormative framing of AIDS and HIV, you get this impression that like, oh, it just like wiped out an entire generation, but that's not true. And because we have that like presupposition, we lose access, or kind of like restrict our own access to reaching out and learning and learning from that generation. As someone who's really interested in HIV history and advocacy, like that just absolutely gets my blood boiling.
Yeah, such a powerful string of responses to that question. Thank you for sharing. I mean, I hope for our listeners and our audience, you kind of see the depth to which our scholars are thinking about these issues. And I think, you know, we're up on time, but I'd be remiss not to ask, you know, how has Point helped make your research and studies possible? And in addition to that, what are your plans going forward? Like, how can we help you execute on your future scholarship?
I can start on this one. So one thing for me, I think Point, the way that the scholarship has been put together is really incredibly thoughtful. And so to have the financial support alongside the mentorship support has been really key for me in developing the way I want to do work that is oriented towards radical queerness, that's oriented towards uplifting queer stories, but also doing LGBTQ plus advocacy in the law. And right now, I have had the opportunity, and I wouldn't have had the opportunity to go to law school without scholarship help at all. So that's one like simple, easy, like definitely thank you to Point for that. And on the other hand, I think with my mentor, I had a long discussion about the kinds of work you can do in law school to really get a sense of what can we do for our communities. And she is the person who pushed me in the direction of working with our LGBTQ plus advocacy clinic. And right now I'm working on a series of impact litigation cases with GLAAD. And I'm so grateful that I had a Point mentor who put me in this direction to say, impact litigation has made all of these different kinds of difference in queer people's lives in just the past couple decades. And I know I'm in courses about it, and I get to be in a law clinic where I actually get to practice that kind of law at a very like student level so far, but hopefully more in the future. And that's definitely something that came to me by the grace of so many community members associated with
Point. For me, I think one of the ways in which Point has been so foundational is I'm just beginning my journey, you know, and my Point Scholarship was one of the points of support that really allowed me to continue garnering support to get here. You know, leaving Trinidad was almost an impossible feat, and was also a point of life-saving. You know, my life had gotten to a point where if I stayed in Trinidad much longer, it may have been to my personal detriment. And so just knowing that, and just knowing also almost every Monday I have an email in my inbox from Points, and I'm like, these people do not sleep. But by that I mean that, you know, it's not just here, take this and go do whatever it is you're doing. It's we want to partner alongside you. We want to uplift you in the many ways in which you are not only on this academic journey, not only on this journey of activism or work in the field, but also just on this journey of life at this time as a queer person. And combined with the mentorship support, and also just combined with the engagement. You know, there's so many points of engagement and genuine engagement where it's not an invisible person on the other end of that email just sending me, you know, communications because that's their day job. It's really people that are invested, that feel to me like they're invested in my life and my story. And, you know, on the days, even now in school when it's midterms and I'm like, oh, I'm sick and fed up already. You know, I think, wow, but I have a little group of cheerleaders already, I have a community, you know, and I'm not alone. And I also can't let, you know, my community down. And to have that as, you know, the Point Foundation is life-changing, you know, so I'm so grateful.
I couldn't agree more. I don't think I'll ever forget the day when I got the call about Point, because y'all do it a really fun way where you give everybody a phone call. You don't know whether it's going to be good or bad news, and you don't get to it very quickly either. And it was just the entire process, but especially getting the call was just the most absolute validating moment of my life. Like, I had just started a lot of this work when I was in school, and so I hadn't been doing it for more than like 2.5 years. And to be seen and validated for the 18 millionth time, and just like appreciated and like recognize that this is like good and something to invest in, especially in my environment, was just absolutely life-changing. But in addition to that, I think the biggest thing that I've got from Point that has indirectly advanced my scholarship and advocacy are just the community that Point gives. Like, all over their website and every email you hear about the Point family, and gosh, is it true? Like, I have met some of like my best friends through Point, even though we've never met in person. And I, like, this little like weird kid from South Carolina, I get to be on a Zoom call as like a panel, like giving my perspective and thoughts and experience with amazing people like George and Kieran and Xoë. Like, that's just mind-blowing. And that really, again, indirectly just makes what I'm doing so much more enjoyable and worthwhile, and makes me feel so much better in doing it. And so I'm just very grateful for Point.
Well, that's it, folks. These are our scholars. Please join me in a nice virtual warm clap for our scholars and for their work. Thank you guys so much. And I'm going to turn it over to our maestro, David Garza.
Thank you, George. And wow, what an incredible and what an engaging conversation. I want to thank you so much, Kieran Gupta, Tyler McDougald, Xoë Sazzle. Thank you for sharing your stories, and thank you for bringing so much of yourselves to this conversation. This conversation is a reminder of why Point even exists and how our history makes us who we are today and shapes our future as well. Every time we have any kind of encounter with our scholars, I personally feel like I learned something really deep. And I know, for example, I'll be thinking about the phrase writing us back into the history that Kieran mentioned. That will stay with me for a long time. So thank you for that, Kieran. And that really sums up so much of what we do together at Point, not just with history, but with all of the work that our scholars do. Thank you also to Dr. George Omwat for moderating this evening's discussion with so much thoughtfulness, intelligence, and brilliance. And thank you to our sponsors, Dr. John Downey and Mr. Brad Heiss, TiVo, Victoria's Secret and Company, and Wells Fargo. I also want to give a special thanks and shout out to our staff member, Nicole Rizzuto, who has spearheaded our efforts to put this showcase together. And I know this is a passion for her as well. When she's not working with us at Point, she also teaches history at a community college in New Jersey. So this is very special for her. So thank you, Nicole, for all of your work. Finally, thank you to everyone who has participated. Thank you for all of our supporters for being here tonight, but also for making all of our work possible. If you were moved and inspired by what you've heard tonight, please do not hesitate to support our work by making a donation at www.pointfoundation.org. This academic year, we are supporting the largest group of Point scholars ever. That's 389 LGBTQ students from across the country. So clearly your generosity goes a long way. Also be sure to follow us on social media to learn more about our scholars and our alums by searching any of the social media channels at Point Foundation. With that, thank you so much again for your support. Happy LGBTQ History Month, and have a wonderful night.